Well, Terry, it's a great privilege to have you here in front of the camera. We meet frequently and have many mutual interests. We are meeting today Professor Terry Coppock from the University of Edinburgh. He is a world traveller and a very well-known geographer colleague with a specialty in resource development, regional development, tourism. All of this will emerge, hopefully, in our conversation. So, Terry, tell me about your career.
Well, I was born in Cardiff in South Wales in 1921. I went to school in South Wales, and geography was my favourite subject at school. But I left school at 16 to go into the civil service, the public service, because there was no possibility of going to university in economic circumstances of those times. And then I spent 7 years in the army during the war, mainly in the Middle East, and that certainly whetted my appetite for travel and my interest in other places. Although, I mean, my prime interest in geography at school had been because it stimulated my interest in other peoples and other countries and other ways of living. And then after the war, I went back into the civil service, again because there was no other alternative, but then it became possible for me, if I was prepared to commit myself to teaching, to go to university. So I decided to abandon my civil service career and went to Cambridge to read geography. There's a little sideline to this that might interest you, and that is that I was a little uncertain when I came back after the war what I should do, and I went to a firm of industrial psychologists to consult them, and they put me through various tests, and then they said, well, I should certainly go to university, and they advised me either to read biology or geography.
I see.
They thought the preference was for biology because perhaps the career opportunities were rather better for a professional biologist. But I had done no biology at school, and I thought, well, my first love was geography, and I would go to Cambridge and read geography. So that's what I did.
Who were the professors there at the time?
Well, Frank Debenham was the head of department. He was an Australian who'd been an Antarctic explorer,
Yes, yes.
and he was a grand old gentleman, but I don't think that he was a great intellectual force in the subject. I suppose the person who influenced me most was Vaughan Lewis, who was a geomorphologist who tragically died in the 1950s in a car crash in the United States. But he was a great enthusiast, and it was infectious. And I took geomorphology and economic geography as my special subjects. The other person was, I've forgotten her Christian name now, Anderson, Margaret Anderson, who was a biogeographer, and she has not left much in the way of written work, but again she was a very effective teacher. She used to walk straight up and down, arms akimbo, up the road, up and down the platform, and it would come out with great clarity, and it opened a door that I had not seen through before.
I see.
And then I started to do research at Cambridge on the evolution of hill slopes, a geomorphological topic. But one day I was invited to go down to London to meet Clifford Derby, and we spent the day together, and then at the end he said, well, how about it? And I said, well, how about what? And he said, well, would you like to come to University College? So I said, well, I'd like to think about it. But he made it quite clear he didn't want a geomorphologist, he wanted somebody on the human side, and of course that was my other string to my bow.
Yes.
He also wanted me, if I came, to do a land use survey of the Chilterns, that's an area northwest of London, because it was approaching the 50th anniversary of the department, and he wanted to have a book that tied various things together in this way. So that's how I got launched on this particular strand. But I should have said that when I was at Cambridge, I used to go to lectures by the Professor of Agriculture, Sir Frank Engeldow, which was about agriculture in a world context. It had a strong geographical flavour about it.
Yes.
And indeed, I dedicated my first my agricultural atlas of England and Wales to Sir Frank Engeldow and got him to write a foreword to it some years later.
Fine.
So there I was then at University College for 15, 16 years, specialising particularly on agricultural geography. And then I was appointed to the chair of geography in Edinburgh, and it was just about that time that I was becoming aware that recreation was an increasingly important aspect of use of rural land.
Now, the year you went to Edinburgh?
Well, it's just the beginning of 66, the end of 65, 66, that was my transition. And I wrote a paper which appeared in the Dutch language periodical Tetra for Economische Sociale Geography, in which I pulled together all that was known, as far as I could find out, about this topic. Yes. It's a bit of a compendium, but it's something of a landmark, because it was one of the first times, at least in British geography, that had been mentioned. And shortly after I came to Edinburgh, I got a grant from the Natural Environment Research Council to start an investigation into the impact of outdoor recreation on the countryside in central Scotland. And that led to building up a small team of people, initially geographers, but increasingly multidisciplinary. I eventually established a tourism and recreation research unit, which at one stage had about 20 people in it, and which has produced a series of, I think, significant reports on various aspects. But I must stress that that work, although it's got a strong geographical flavour, and my interest, of course, is primarily geographical, is a multidisciplinary one.
Yes, that's very important, I think. Yes.
I'd also developed an interest in automated cartography. It seemed to me, from quite an early stage with the development of computers, that this was going to give us the potential to handle data in ways which had not previously been possible. My impression was that we as geographers spent so much time putting our facts together and putting them down that we were then too exhausted perhaps to do the full explorations and thinking that we ought to do about them. And I started off in a very minor sort of way, very primitive sort of way, using a modified line printer to produce agricultural maps. And that again has led to the development of a small unit in Edinburgh doing that sort of work. I wouldn't like to put myself forward as an expert in this field, but I certainly saw the need for it.
Yes, indeed. Don't you think that is one of our biggest needs, is this graphic language to express succinctly what we have come up with from our travels and explorings?
Yes, I'm sure about that, and I think it's one of the things that is absolutely fundamental for the next 10 years or so in geography, that better ways of handling and analysing spatial data, and it's our opportunity. If we don't grasp it, I think we'll find that other people have done so. But that of course led off in other directions too, because I have represented the Royal Society, that is the premier British academy, on the Ordnance Survey Map Users Committee for a number of years. And then when in 1978 the government set up a committee looking to the long-term future of the Ordnance Survey, our national mapping agency, the Royal Society suggested me as a member of this. And again, I was the only geographer on this group, but I think its work has been important and will be important for the future of British mapping.
Yes, indeed. The cartography side of you, where did that begin? Was it at London or at Cambridge? The strong cartographic orientation? Well,
it's largely sort of self-induced, because when I was given this task in 1950 of undertaking this land use survey, I decided to switch my research interests from geomorphology to land use and changing land use. And that led me to get involved with agricultural statistics. These are collected in great detail in Britain for quite small units. And there was a major problem about handling that. Though the first thing it seemed to me was important, and something we've not been as good as we ought to be about, was understanding the nature of the data and its spatial limitations. The data that is nominally under administrative areas in Britain in relation to agricultural censuses is not contained within the administrative boundary. I know it's a rather complicated idea, but
I can understand.
Unless you understand it, you can't know how to map them properly. So it was something born of necessity. I mean, I did something like 500,000 calculations by slide rule and manual plotting at an early stage in that. And if you want a way to convince you of the advantages of computing, then that's it.
Yes, I think it's one of the, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, but there has been this, the first survey was for a publication, yes?
Yes.
But this later work has more of a practical interest, an applied interest.
Well, yes, I mean, I've produced, as you probably know, a series of agricultural atlases of England and Wales and of Scotland. Initially, these were produced with a computer base and then drawn manually, but then subsequently produced as computer output for direct plate making from that. Now, they were more than atlases because they were essentially descriptions and attempted explanations of what was shown, and there's probably more text than there is atlas. The other work you're referring to, yes, but it's not me involved as a cartographer. It's me is involved as a member of committees looking at applications of cartography. And first in relation to the Ordnance Survey, and then I was a member of another committee looking at the mapping requirements of the Natural Environment Research Council, which is very much involved in automated cartography and how it ought to develop. But of course that too has a much wider implication. And then I got involved as a member of a committee producing evidence for a select committee on remote sensing and digital mapping, representing the Royal Society and representing the Royal Geographical Society. So I've become perhaps an exponent rather than a practitioner. No, if that's not the right word, I'm not quite sure.
But you're seen as geography's man in these various...
Well, elder statesman perhaps, yes.
Yes, whatever. But
there are lots of younger people doing much more active work than I am in this field.
Yes, well, I'm certain you deserve that position, but the distinction I'm trying to make is between those in cartography who are primarily concerned about the aesthetics and the graphic precision and so on, from a theoretical point of view, and those who want to make mapping useful for societal interests, and you have both interests.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's always seemed to me in geography, it's rather like the old lady who said, how can I know what I think till I hear what I say? Until you've mapped it, you don't know what the questions you're really going to ask are. Right. That's true of some geographical problems, and many, I think, that we are concerned with. Although now remote sensing and, of course, the ability to see phenomena from the air raise questions in your mind without the necessity of mapping. You can have the direct experience, if you like, and see, well, these are problems, these are puzzling aspects of man's use of the Earth's surface and how they come about. And
but you have been a great traveller.
That's true,
and
yes.
You have seen landscapes from the air. Do you see a direct link with your cartographic interest and your travel interest?
No, I don't think so. No, I mean, my cartographic interest has come primarily from the need to handle census-type statistical data. Although, I see through remote sensing, of course, that the direct sensing of data and its cartographic representation are coming together very closely, and that will be an increasing need in the future.
I think it's very exciting.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, but there's two images, you see, the cartographer who is at home studying the detail versus the explorer, in a way, who has to represent what he has just experienced graphically.
Yes, I'm an explorer from the air on commercial airlines rather than an explorer in the other sense.
Yes. Well, tell about your travels. You really have travelled quite a bit.
Yes, I must say it did something for me the first time I flew around the world. It's a purely psychological thing, I think, but to start off in the same place and go westbound and come back to the same place. Yes, well, I think I've been in every major country in the world, and certainly in every continent, with the exception of Antarctica. And I still find travel extremely exciting. My great problem is to persuade airlines that I want a window seat with a clear view of the ground, And my preference, of course, is for flying in aircraft like Fokker Friendships, high-wing monoplanes with large windows that you can look out of.
Most exceptional passenger.
Yes.
Yes.
But it's irritating when you, I mean, it's only natural when you look at maps, satellite imagery of the Earth's surface, how much of it is cloud covered at any one time. And although flying above the clouds may be fine in terms of smooth passages, for a geographer it's extremely irritating.
Right, I can well imagine. But a European geographer also, I think, is much more sensitive to the fine nuances.
That is true, yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'll fly point to point, not at all towards the landscape. Yes. Which of those travels now, what impressed you most? Was it the sense of achievement, conquest of distance, or was it to study variations of landscape?
Well, I think it varied with the journey. When I flew the other day from Tokyo to Moscow across Siberia by day, and the mile after mile of little occupied land was displayed beneath the aircraft, it couldn't but impress you of the vastness and emptiness of Siberia. Oh, that's a very naive observation, I know. But I think the thing travelling from the air has done for me is give a direct impact of things that I knew about in a way, but there is an image which is retained mentally in a much more vivid form than you could possibly get by reading the best descriptions there are.
Or even looking at an atlas.
Quite, yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, I do believe that travel is essential for geographers, and it remains for me an exciting business.
But culturally, what has struck you most from your travels?
Well, culturally, one of the things that strikes me most, and this again may be a naive observation, is as far as the big cities of the world are concerned, increasing cultural similarity. I think one sees this most in respect of young people. I know Alistair Cook, talking in North American cities some years back, said that you could be deposited in any one of them blindfold, and you, well, with few exceptions, like San Francisco and possibly New York, you wouldn't know where it was, where you were. And certainly at a level of superficial cultural similarity, this has struck me increasingly in Rio or in Moscow or in Beijing or in Sydney, that this degree of similarity, and I wonder to what extent, I mean, there is a cultural convergence in that way. I think it's there to some degree, and it's maybe superficially, but
or that the techno systems.
Yes. Well, I think that is also true. Yes.
Yes. And you can bring all that back home to your teaching and research.
Yes, I have a vast collection of colour slides taken from aircraft, and while I wouldn't go along with one of my colleagues, not my colleague in Edinburgh, who insists that no one shall show a slide in a regional course which he or she has not taken himself or herself. I do think that something you have taken yourself gives an immediacy to a talk, to a lecture, that is not otherwise possible.
Yes, I agree with you entirely, yes. So you have many activities, teaching, research, consultant, various commissions and boards.
Yes, and far too many, I'm afraid.
Yes, and you still have time for your own personal research curiosities.
Yes, well, I think that is an essential. If once a geographer loses that interest, once any academic loses that interest, then you really ought to give up, I think. But far too much of my time has been taken up over the last 10 years in sitting on government committees and working with various other organisations. I'm a member of the Scottish Sports Council, for example, which comes out of my recreational interest. And that probably takes a day a week, up to a day a week of my time throughout the year. And when you multiply that by perhaps 20 other committees, it takes up an awful lot of time. But there are spin-offs, of course, that there are benefits from contacts with people and seeing things in different ways that compensate for this. And I mean, I have a lot of interest in that, in that anyway as a topic.
Yes, I can see. Yes, for example, your membership of the Sports Council, I imagine, is helpful in your work on tourism and recreation. I'm really fascinated by what you're doing in that field.
Well, in fact, the officer who works to my committee, I'm chairman of the Facilities Planning Committee in the Scottish Sports Council, is a geographer who was a professor of geography in Canada, and we have a close relationship there. In fact, we're writing a joint paper on planning for recreation.
Professor Watson?
No, this is not Professor Watson. This is Ivor Davis, who was at Lakehead University. But of course, most of my work there has been in relation to the Tourism and Recreation Research Unit. And I've had increasingly to move into a multidisciplinary field there because while we have been very important, we as geographers have been very important in identifying some of the spatial characteristics and spatial impacts of outdoor recreation, when it comes to understanding the motivations, then we have to join hands with our sociologists and social psychologist friends. And that's certainly the direction in which these kinds of studies are moving. Our interest, my interest particularly, had been in rural areas, and I think that this is a natural for geographers because the resource and the home base are necessarily widely spaced. There is a journey to play, there are important interactions with rural communities and with rural resources. And we've just been doing an interesting study for a group of public agencies in Britain called the Economic Well-Being of Communities in National Parks in England and Wales. Now that may sound very strange to you, but yes, national parks in England and Wales have quite substantial communities living within them. They are not publicly owned land. They are land designated because of their scenic beauty and other characteristics, and they contain living communities within them, and they are in private ownership and they are used for agriculture and for forestry and so on. But of course, the idea of conserving that landscape is to some extent at variance with the idea of the well-being of the communities, and it's a matter of reconciling that. It's also part of the legislation to establish national parks that the bodies responsible must promote the enjoyment of these areas by the public. So there are three sets of interests which have to be reconciled, and that again was to me as a geographer a very interesting topic.
Have any of those people moved out? The people whose farmsteads are enclosed within national parks?
Well, I mean, they share many of the same characteristics of the remoter rural areas of Britain anyway. They are areas of rural depopulation, but of course they are also, some of them at least, important tourist areas like the Lake District or like Exmoor. And of course this has attracted a large number of people. The tourism and recreation provides part of the economic base of these areas. And one of the questions we were looking at was how far can tourism provide a satisfactory basis for community existence in these areas. And in many ways it seemed that it is a very satisfactory one because there are few jobs available for women in these areas. You can generate jobs fairly quickly and fairly cheaply by comparison with other activities. And although it has something of a name as a bad employer, cheap labour, cheap seasonal labour, I think that there is potential there that's important to look at.
But I was thinking more of the efficiency imperative on anyone involved with agriculture.
Yes.
Say, whether it would be impossible for a small farmstead to survive.
Well, I mean, this is part of a problem of the British landscape overall, because the forces within agriculture are encouraging farm enlargement, encouraging enlargement of fields, and these are inconsistent with the characteristics of the British landscape, particularly the landscape of lowland England as it's evolved over the centuries. In fact, the paper I wrote for this conference was entitled Conservation and Agriculture, and was looking at the interaction between agriculture, and particularly crop cultivation and agriculture, and conservation. One of the approaches we suggested in our report was the possibility of a compensation, a subsidy if you like, to farmers to farm in traditional ways, because farmers were reacting quite naturally as economic man to a situation of prices and of technical developments, and we suggested that they could be compensated, they could be encouraged to employ more labour than they would otherwise do, they could be encouraged to maintain features like stone walls and hedgerows and so on, which are characteristic features. Now, obviously you couldn't do this throughout the country as a whole, but there are certainly trends in thinking in conservation circles in Britain which are favourable to that kind of approach.
Is there any hope of dialogue between the agrarian interests and the conservation interests?
Yes, I think so. We've developed what a series of groups, farming and wildlife advisory groups, or in Scotland, farming, forestry and wildlife advisory groups, which bring together conservationists and conservation-disposed farmers to try and show how land can be farmed in ways which are consistent with conservation interests. And we hope that this will have a spread effect. The Countryside Commission in England and Wales, which is the body responsible for scenic conservation, has just published a document suggesting that it develop a series of linked farms to the farms in the farming and wildlife advisory groups to try and spread the effects of this knowledge of how this can be done. There is a dispute in Britain of whether this ought to be a subject for planning control, whether farmers ought to be prevented from doing things.
Yes.
But I think the general consensus is that one ought to be trying to create a situation where it's in farmers' own interests to conserve landscape features and to conserve wildlife. It's unreasonable to complain about farmers doing what is a response to government policy for agriculture designed for other purposes.
Yes, yes. Oh, that should be an enormous challenge.
It is, but I think it's going to happen in Europe too. I mean, I think that there is already within, for example, the Less Favoured Areas Directive of the European Economic Commission, the basis for an approach of that kind.
Yes, yes. It's exciting.
It is indeed,
This
yes.
is your tourism interest. I want to move to another aspect of your work, Terry. You're from the Celtic fringe.
Yes, marginally. Yes.
I'm very proud to also be Celtic. And I think Scotland, Wales and maybe Ireland have contributed quite substantially to English geography.
Yes.
Would you like to comment a little on how you
Well, I think there are quite a large number of Welshmen occupying positions in British geography and in chairs in English universities. My predecessor on the British National Committee for Geography was Clifford Darby, who was a very distinguished Welshman too. I've just had as a colleague Reeford Watson, who combines being a Canadian and a Scot, I think, but we've a very lively department in Edinburgh. I don't know that I can identify any specific Celtic contribution in this sense, but of course the physical makeup of Wales and of Scotland, with its predominance of upland and large areas of moorland, its marginal farming conditions, does create circumstances which have demanded different adjustments. And of course we've each inherited farming systems, traditional farming systems, which in the Scottish context were of course fossilised by legislation in the late 19th century in the crofting counties. But incidentally that shows that it isn't very easy by legislation to hold back the tide, because many of those crofts now are either farmed in absentia or owned in absentia, occupied in absentia, are not farmed or run down, and the proportion that are actively cultivated is still quite small.
Yes. Oh, I think there's questions being posed about the legislative approach to solving problems all over Europe, not just in history. We seem to not learn from history. No, but I think this Welsh thing must have been related to some very strong, powerful teachers at Aberystwyth or someplace, because there's certainly a whole generation of Welshmen who have influenced English geography.
Yes, well, I can't claim to be among that group in the sense that I went rather late in life to Cambridge, and although and Clifford Derby had moved on from then. But you're certainly right, as far as Aberystwyth is concerned, and Emerisbury, and of course Fleur, who was earlier there, Eston Evans. These are all people who've had an influence, and perhaps the Welsh way with words has had an important influence in this respect.
Celtic way with
Celtic
words.
way.
How would you characterize the present situation in geography in England generally? It seems to be prolific in its production. How would you characterize the situation?
Well, we're going through a very difficult time at present because the government has been cutting back on university expenditure generally, and we've had to take our share of that. I mean, to take my own department in Edinburgh, we have lost 4 members of staff over the last 3 years, and we've only had 1 replacement. And we're being told to look at the possibilities of 5% reduction per annum, 10% reduction per annum over the next few years. And that's not easy to accommodate, and it doesn't help in 2 respects. It doesn't help new posts be created, and perhaps people like me ought to get out so that younger people can come on. But, and of course, it doesn't help in new initiatives to be started. What we must do there, I think, is link ourselves to some of the areas which government itself recognises as important. Information technology is a classic example, which relates to automated cartography, which relates to remote sensing. And 2 of our main outlets for geographers in recent times have now, at least temporarily, been blocked. I mean, many geographers did initially go into teaching. This was particularly true, before the Second World War and immediately afterwards. Then planning became a major outlet. Something like 40% of the graduates entering graduate planning schools in Britain at one stage were geographers. But that is something also that, because of government cuts back in finance, have been a door that has been closed temporarily. Now, I mean, many of our geographers have been going off into business as administrative trainees, going off into market research, going off into a wide variety of jobs. But I say the current situation is not helpful for geography, I think, in this respect.
Has it discovered any alternative directions for itself?
Well, what is surprising to me, and with those 2 areas blocked, as it were, that we haven't had more serious problems of getting employment for our graduates than we have. My own view is that geography is an excellent background, excellent basis, not background, a basis for a postgraduate training of some kind, and this needn't necessarily be in geography, but in a related field, in soils, in planning, in conservation, and in recreation management, a whole series of fields. I think too we've got to develop master's programs of our own of that kind. We're looking at the moment at a master's degree in geographic information systems, which I think is going to be an important area of how to handle data and how to organize data, and what sort of questions to ask of data, what are the characteristics of data. These are some of the important questions which we've tended to neglect in the past.
Yes, that's exciting.
But we're doing this on reduced resources, which doesn't help.
Well, poverty can be
creative. Concentrates the mind.
Yes. I mean, you all learned that through the war.
Well, when I think after the war, when I joined University College in 1950, there were 5 of us. When I left in 1965, there were 25 of us. And while in part this reflects the growth of the subject, it's not possible, I think, now for any one individual to be a master of the whole of the subject. But I think some of my younger colleagues don't appreciate fully how well off we are in many circumstances in relation to facilities. I mean, we're just moved to a situation now where we have a departmental fax computer. We're having installed a terminal in each room of each member of the faculty, and that will relate us to word processing, it will relate us to graphics, it will relate us to a whole variety of opportunities. And we've something like 10 mini computers in the department and access to mainframe computers, and our new generation of graduates is computer literate in a way that the older among us are not.
Are they literate in other areas?
No, and I think that's a major problem. And I like the idea that one of the products of a geographic education should be somebody who is numerate, literate, and in Billy Bolton's word, I don't like it, graphicate. Yes, that who is able to think spatially and to use spatial means of communication, who can write clear English and who can express himself well, and who is able to use numerical data to make sense of numerical data. And if we send out graduates into the world with those three characteristics, I think they should do well.
Yes, I think so too. It's the backup from the humanistic side and the understanding side that gets people worried when they hear about a whole department equipped like yours.
But I don't think that means that we are all high-powered model builders. And after all, you take a subject like the Domesday Geography of England. Now, that involved an immense manipulation of data. Yes. That is something that could so much more readily have been done if it had been computer-based. Now, the time wasn't right when it started, but when I think of all those long division sums and all that manual plotting, and when I think of the tasks ahead of us, then it seems to me these are aids to doing better some of the things we've done traditionally in the past. And while I am fully sympathetic to ideas of model building and to ideas of theoretical geography, and I am sympathetic to the challenges that are being made to us to look at the assumptions we bring. I still think that in many ways these are developments which enable us to do some of the things that we've been doing for a very long time, but to do them better.
I really do agree with you. I've been doing some experimenting more recently. One final question. You who have had so many friends around the world and traveled so much, one of the problems today is that we're not able to learn from each other in various countries. There are exciting things happening in Edinburgh and Seattle maybe still, and in Japan maybe. Do you think that if geographers who are graduating in your cluster on geographic information systems, do you think that they can be better equipped to think about the question of international communication among geographers?
Well, I agree. I do, because it seems to me that one of the increasingly important things in the world is that we have to think about the world as a whole. I mean, now this has always been part of geography, but it's now a practical necessity. And intercommunication of data, intercommunication of ideas is going to be extremely important. We were talking yesterday to an international agency about this question. How do you know what is going on? How do you know who is expert in particular areas? How do you know what has been done? How do you know what information is available? And those are extremely important questions, which we have now the potential to answer. They require a lot in the way of organisation to get them off the ground in ways that can be universally applied. But I think this is the most exciting time to be alive. I hope I'm still going by the time some of these things come to fruition.
Well, I certainly hope you do, and I'm sure you will, because that is a tremendous challenge, and that's been a mark of a lot of your work. You have really pushed us to think along fresh lines and be hopeful about what we're doing. I want to thank you so much for coming today. I know we have lots more we could talk about, but this has been most fruitful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.